12:32 here in downtown Halifax. A beautiful Thursday afternoon. Thanks for joining us. I'm Andrew Peterson in for Sheldon Macleod this week. Here's what's coming up for you over the next 3 hours. Here with you until 3:30 this afternoon. The Province's Council to Improve Classroom Conditions has announced a new initiative to bolster school attendance in Nova Scotia. We'll see 14 attendance support workers hired in the new year through pilot projects across the province. Council member Jennifer Bruce is a teacher at E.B. Chandler Junior High in Amherst. She'll join us later on this hour to discuss the new initiative. The PCs are calling into question the transparency of the QE2 hospital redevelopment projects in the province with the recent announcement of the purchase of the old CBC building on Summer Street. Health critic Elizabeth Smith-McCrossin says the McNeil Liberals' piecemeal rollout of this development project highlights the need for more details and all of those details to be made public. We'll check in with her after the 1 o'clock news. Defense Minister Harjit Sajid is in Brussels taking part in Remembrance Day ceremonies as well as some NATO meetings there. He'll join us in the 1 o'clock hour to discuss his trip, those counter-ISIS meetings, and the upcoming Remembrance Day ceremonies all over the world and here in Canada. A Truro man says that he's photographed a lynx on his property. Glenn Kay says he was recently able to capture a picture of the big cat that has all the markings of the lynx. We'll check in with wildlife biologist Bob Bancroft to discuss those claims. Some on Regional Council looking for the province to speed up the process on some of their requests coming from Regional Council. Councillor Laura Lee Nicol will join us to discuss what the holdup is on some of these requests. We'll have an open hour from 2 until 3 o'clock today where everything and anything goes. Luke Aravac with the Atlantic chapter of Restaurants Canada will join us after the 3 o'clock news to discuss the latest report card on provincial liquor policies. He says that we've shown some progress here in the province, but there's still much work to be done. And we'll wrap up the show speaking with Jennifer Johnston. She's a professor in behavioral science at Western New Mexico University in Silver Lake. In light of the recent horrific mass shooting in Texas and a number of recent mass shootings, she thinks that the media should stop naming mass shooters publicly. So we'll check in with her about those thoughts just before we wrap up the show at 3:15. But first up today, U.S. President Donald Trump has saluted the growing friendship between the U.S. and China on his recent Asia trip. Trump and First Lady Melania Trump were the guests of honor at a state dinner earlier today at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. Now, the dinner has capped off 2 days of pageantry and negotiations between the president of China and Trump. As at the dinner, neither man made mention of some thorny issues like trade and attempts to pressure North Korea to abandon its nuclear weapons program. Joining me to discuss Trump's Asia trip, as well as his first year in office that's being celebrated this week, is Elliot Tepper. He's with the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University in Ottawa. Good afternoon, Elliot.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, well, good morning where you are. But Elliot, Trump earlier called on China to address some unfair trade practices that drive what he called a shockingly large trade deficit. But he stopped short of castigating the Chinese President Xi Jinping, saying he doesn't blame the country for taking advantage of past U.S. administrations. How does this kind of differ from some of the rhetoric we've seen from past presidents on state visits to China?
This has been a remarkable Asia tour, really, in all kinds of ways. But one of them is the relationship between the two leaders, Xi Jinping, who's newly ensconced as a core leader, as the central leader in China. He's a strong man now, and Donald Trump. So we have a weakened American president who doesn't apparently want to lead in Asia or anywhere else, going to see a Chinese leader who is newly strengthened and does say, well, I'll lead. And that's the setting as the summit, so to speak, was held. The state visit, I'm not sure it was officially a state visit, was held. But certainly what we saw were two leaders who were quite determined, and I give both leaders full marks for this, to have some kind of a relationship as one of the great powers that rises up, and what was the only great power has to now accommodate a more multipolar world. So good for them for saying we're going to find a way to get along and to do good business together. But to answer your question, it's quite a remarkable performance. Previous American presidents have gone out of their way to mention human rights and have gone out of their way to emphasize that, America is there really to assert itself in China's court, in their own home court. That's not the case.
And you mentioned human rights. An issue that was brought up yesterday was that no journalists were allowed to ask any questions of both leaders after a formal press conference there, which kind of bucked the trend. I believe President Obama was one of the things that he wanted was to make sure that journalists were able to ask questions there. Does that send a message that perhaps Donald Trump is weakening on his pressure on China, not just in trade but on human rights? Is there an issue that perhaps his priorities are different than past presidents?
Well, Obama also held a town hall, so it's an open forum where questions were answered and given and so forth. So the fact that Donald Trump does not want a press conference does not necessarily indicate anything about China. The two leaders may have a similar view toward the press. That's not news. What is news is that if you stand back and say, well, what came out of this trip, all we can say about publicly, we don't know actually what went on behind the scenes or what will come out that they talked about. But all we know publicly is that throughout his trip, this is not his first stop. First he went to China, then to Japan, and then South Korea, now to Beijing, and there's more coming. Donald Trump has really backed away very dramatically in terms of saying we're going to go to Asia and demand a whole different set of terms of trade. We're going to change the structure of how America does business with these countries which are taking advantage of us. Remember, in South Korea, he wanted to renegotiate the South Korea American Trade Pact right in the middle of the nuclear crisis. And he accused the South Korean leader of being weak and an appeaser and so forth. So the tone of this whole visit seems to be substantially different. He is sticking to his teleprompter. That is, he's being very diplomatic and very presidential. He's saying things that other American presidents might say, although with his own spin on it. But most importantly, he's not, that we can tell, picking on these countries that's going to lead to trade wars. We're not going to hear talk, apparently, that tariffs are going to be slapped on everything coming out of countries where there's deficits. Now it's a normal trade mission. He just signed a gigantic package of kind of intentions for China to spend money in America. A lot of these are recycled, repackaged. So very typical trade. If you spend more money in America, then this trade issue that I talked about with my followers, which was, jobs are being taken overseas because of unfair trade practices. No structural reform nor trade wars seem to be emanating.
And just a little to touch on that a little bit, just in terms of domestic politics, that was a big Steve Bannon kind of wing of the party, was to push China, that, it's their fault for a lot of our economic woes. Do you anticipate that wing of the party, the Steve Bannon wing of the party, to continue to hit China on some of these issues?
Well, that's the interesting point I was just trying to make, that we see a different approach to what we do about deficits, we being America, right, in this case, by the president, saying it's not that just bad trade deals were involved and they took advantage of us. He actually congratulated Xi Jinping for taking advantage of America because he was just so good at it, and Americans, his predecessors, were so bad. That includes Republican predecessors, were so bad at it, and he's just looking out for his own people. But we are going to redress it by all these new investment deals. There's, as near as we can tell, remember there's two parts to this visit. One is on the trade and deficit side, the other is on North Korea and lining up support. So on the trade and deficit side, what we are seeing out of this tour so far is in Japan and South Korea, well, if you buy a whole lot more military supplies from us and spend a lot more money, then that trade deficit won't look so bad. And in China, we just heard him say, well, we're signing billions of dollars of hundreds of billions of dollars of trade deals, some of which may or may not go through, some of which Americans may resent when they hear the details. This is totally different than the rhetoric and the planning of the Republican Party as articulated by the president. The Bannon wing, they will have to say, look, one of these trade deals was to bring a huge Chinese investment in West Virginia, coal country, but in this case in natural gas. And that's great news. There's going to be jobs created and so forth until somebody eventually is going to say, Andrew, wait a minute, you're turning over control of natural gas in America to a Chinese company? So there's going to be downstream payback on this someplace or another. However, on the trade side, it's turning into a conventional trade mission overseas rather than structural reform and major changing of trading terms of trade between America and Asia so far that we can tell. On the North Korea side, we don't see anything tangible yet coming out of either the South Korea Japanese or so far Chinese visit. Now, what goes on behind the scenes, we don't know. Rex Tillerson said lots tougher talk on both trade and North Korea happened behind the scenes, Secretary of State, who is along on all this. But so far, we don't see much actually happening in terms of a president who says he's transformational, transforming anything.
And on that North Korea point, we've seen, the president of China and Trump coming out with a united front saying, we can't allow North Korea to become nuclear or to have nuclear weapons. But we've also kind of seen Trump dial back that rhetoric against the North Korean leadership on his trip. We haven't heard the comments of fire and fury and what have you. Why do you think that trip is dialed back? Do you think someone behind the scenes in China or South Korea or Japan is saying, look, this is our region here that you're kind of putting at risk? Why do you think the dialed back rhetoric?
This entire trip seems to be going, if you could put it in this frame, very well for the president. That is, we're seeing teleprompter Trump, not Twitter Trump. He is sticking to well-crafted speeches. The South Korean speech was as good as I've seen him give on any subject. These are moderate, well-scripted. Almost any American president could say something like this in every stop so far. Behind the scenes, one of the things to come out is that there's a strengthening of the personal relationship between the Japanese leader, Shinzo Abe, with whom Trump apparently is in quite frequent communication, more than has been publicly known or announced, and also Xi Jinping. This relationship seems to be strengthened. So they're counting on personal relationships here rather than changing the equation. All of this is intended to line up a more united front and doing something about North Korea. But China, of course, is the key factor in all of this, and we have no way of knowing if China is actually going to change its behavior toward North Korea as a result of Donald Trump's personal intervention today.
And one of the other interesting things to come out of this, as you mentioned, U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is along on this trip. He's saying that a meeting between Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin is still under consideration. I just wonder what your initial thoughts of that would be. Obviously, we know that the Russia investigation is in full swing south of the border. What do you think of the thought that these two leaders could end up meeting? Is this just a simple fact that, two leaders of two very big countries in this world need to meet and need to talk? I just wonder your thoughts on that.
Well, we should also say, why is Trump in Asia? He's going to Vietnam to attend a meeting of a very large economic organization that Russia's part of. So there's likely to be a meeting. I would think there will be a meeting, unless something happens, between the two leaders on the sidelines of the APEC meeting in Vietnam. And yes, you could say that, sure, there should be a meeting because, after all, one of the primary purposes of this trip is North Korea, and lining up support by both China, do more, fix this problem for us, and change your equation of your own national interest. And that's the American message. And then the same message is to Russia, who's also helping North Korea, although on a much smaller scale. So at a formal level, it makes sense for these two leaders to meet. But Rex Tillerson has said, I don't know why he's saying these things where we can hear it. Don't expect anything to come out of that because really they've got nothing to say to each other. So there's nothing of substance. So, yes, I would expect there to be a meeting of these leaders to follow on from all of the other heads of government that he's meeting.
And Elliot, just up against the clock, didn't really get a chance to talk about first year in office, but thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it, as always.
Well, you're very welcome, Andrew.
Take care. It's Elliot Tepper. He's with the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University in Ottawa. Just weighing in on Trump's current trip to China today, his Asia-wide trip, but today he's in China. So just weighing in on some of the discussions happening around trade in North Korea there. We're going to take a quick break, and on the other side, going to chat about the Province's Council to Improve Classroom Conditions. They've started a new initiative about nearly $2 million invested to address student attendance. We'll check in with Jennifer Bruce. She's a council member after the break.